and a very warm welcome to the channel. It is time for another The Fat Electrician reaction. So if you haven't seen it before, this is a great channel. I was about to say little channel, really isn't a little channel. It's a great channel. It does videos about history, mainly American history, but it does it in a way which is both entertaining and informative. And honestly, I've learned about quite a few major figures from American history and American politics that I'd just never heard of through this channel, who I feel I really should have heard of, especially as I did history at university, so a little bit embarrassed about that. Today's video is 450 Marines versus the Imperial Japanese Navy at Wake Island. So I'm presuming that's the Second World War, unless there's been some fairly major geopolitical events I've missed. I think this will be really interesting. Link to the original video in the description, so please go show that channel some love. Great channel. If you want to show me some love and subscribe, I would not be angry. I will not complain, put it that way. And guys, let's enjoy the video.
During World War II, the Japanese military used to think that the Marines were all recruited from prisons and insane asylums, which, to be honest, it's always made sense to me, but after researching for this video, it's starting to make dollars.
Yeah.
Today we're talking about the first time that the United States Marine Corps would come toe-to-toe with the Japanese military.
First time.
Ladies and gentlemen, Wake Island, a small coral atoll 2,000 miles west of Hawaii, closer to Japan than it was to America,
so
and highly sought after by the Japanese to be a forward operating base for World War II. The only problem with that was, it was currently held by the Americans. 450 Marine Corps artillerymen and 1,200 civilian construction workers, as well as 70 Navy corpsmen. In this context, for the layman, if you don't know, Navy corpsman is a fancy word for Marine Corps medic, aka Doc. And they didn't have much to defend the island with, but they did have 6 5-inch coastal artillery guns that were actually taken from America's first ever battleship, the original USS Texas from the 1800s.
Oh, wow. Was that one of the ships? I know there's like a famous event in American naval history, well, the White Fleet, I think it was called. A bunch of ships kind of painted white all went on. Was it Teddy Roosevelt sent them off? And it was kind of like the first big show American naval power. So was the Texas involved in that? If you know, please do comment below, because I would be genuinely fascinated.
They also had 12 3-inch anti-aircraft guns, 18 M2 Browning machine guns, 30 Browning 30 caliber machine guns, as well as 12 Grumman F4F Wildcat fighters. In regards to time, Wake Island is 22 hours ahead of Hawaii, meaning that from their perspective, Pearl Harbor would take place on December 8th, 1941. Oh. An hour after the attack on Pearl Harbor had ended, Wake would receive a transmission saying that Pearl Harbor had occurred and that they needed to be prepared.
Yeah.
2 hours after that...
This is really interesting. So straight after Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army went on essentially a blitzkrieg right across the Pacific, targeting not only Americans, although I mean clearly a lot of American sites were targeted, but also British, French, Dutch, and it's actually quite crazy how much they conquered in the kind of the first 10 months or so before all started. Well, maybe a year before all started to fall apart.
That 27 Japanese bombers would conduct an air raid on Wake Island, destroying 8 of their 12 F4F Wildcat fighters before they even left the airstrip. At this point, 400 civilian construction workers would volunteer to help fight if it came to that, and the Marines began training them on how to operate machine guns immediately, while also fortifying fighting positions. Wake Island would then be bombed again on the 9th, and on December 11th, 1941, an entire Japanese naval detachment would arrive at Wake Island, and the battle for Wake would officially begin. As the Marines, the Navy corpsmen, and the construction workers rushed to their battle stations, they would see that they were incredibly outmanned and outgunned. The Japanese had brought with them 3 light cruisers, 6 destroyers, 3 submarines, 1 submarine tender, 2 PT boats, and 2 amphibious landing ships equipped with 450 special naval landing forces.
I mean, that's a lot of firepower, because a cruiser's kind of between a battleship and like a destroyer or a frigate. So I don't think you really get them that for quite so often. I guess you do a bit. The Moscow, which got sunk by the Ukrainians, was a cruiser. But yeah, I think they're rarer than they were, but it's a lot of firepower.
Of the Japanese, which is essentially the Japanese equivalent of Marines. As the entire Japanese naval detachment advanced closer and closer to the island, they would finally come within striking distance of the Marine artillery, 12,000 yards. Despite that, and much to the confusion of the Marines, they were all ordered to hold their fire, which made absolutely no sense to them. These men could hit bullseyes at 12,000 yards. These guys would put a fucking 5-inch shell through a bedroom window if they wanted to. Why on earth are they being told to hold their fire? But the man in charge of the Marines, Commander Devereaux, realized that the Japanese artillery on the ships actually outranged the Marine artillery and they weren't firing yet. And this must mean that the Japanese thought that their air raids had disabled all of the Marine defenses on the island, which was not true at all, because in reality the only thing they had taken out was the original 8 Wildcats from day one. So under the command of Major Devereaux, the Marines would continue to hold their fire and play possum as the entire detachment advanced closer and closer. 10,000 yards, 8,000 yards, 6,000 yards, 4,000 yards, which as far as a Marine artilleryman is concerned, is point blank fucking range. If they got any closer, these Marines were going to try to put a bayonet on this 5-inch gun, okay? The Marines would finally be given the order to open fire, and they would open fire with everything they had and put as many shells downrange as they possibly could, taking the Japanese completely off guard and hitting almost all of their ships with effective fire. In a matter of minutes, they were able to sink one of the destroyers by hitting it twice in its magazine.
And they're using these really old guns, right? Which is kind of interesting that they were still so effective. I noticed that there's a really famous incident in the invasion of Norway, which was in 1940, I believe, where a quite considerable German warship was sunk by incredibly ancient Norwegian coastal defences. I think there's a film about it, but anyway, I'm going off track.
Magazine, the destroyer Hayate would be sunk in 12 minutes. And I cannot stress to you what a big deal this is. At this point in time, Japan has effectively attacked Pearl Harbor and 27 other locations in the Pacific, and they have never lost a single naval vessel. And it took the Marine artillerymen 12 minutes to put one completely under the waterline. Panicking and not knowing what to do, the Japanese naval detachment would turn and retreat. And it is at this point that they would realize that they made a fatal flaw in their attack strategy because they didn't bring a carrier.
I mean, honestly, the whole decision for Japan to... I know this is like going into bigger questions. The whole decision by Japan to attack America and Pearl Harbor, etc., was basically nuts. I mean, if you look at the kind of the economic might of the United States versus Japan, the sheer difference in industrial capacity, it was always very, very likely that war was going to end up really, really badly for Japan. So even though they had a year where they kind of surprised everyone and did really well, in the end, the odds were always massively against them. So yeah, it was a pretty crazy thing for them to do.
And they brought no planes for air support. Cue this man, Henry Elrod, aka Hammer and Hank, and one of the first main characters that would ever enter the battlefield in World War II on America's behalf. Himself and the other 3 Grumman Wildcat fighters would take off into the sky. They would realize that the Japanese naval detachment came with no carrier and no airplanes overhead, and let's face it, Japanese AA guns might as well be crewed by fucking stormtroopers because they can't hit shit. So the 4 Wildcat pilots take off and proceed to kick the entire naval detachment in the
that's quite... So they've got air supremacy with 4 aircraft. Not exactly midway.
Ass on the way out as they strafe their decks with machine gun fire and drop 100-pound bombs on their decks. Now, a 100-pound bomb and machine gun fire absolutely should never be able to sink a major naval vessel, like ever. Good old Hammer and Hank, though, managed to park one of those 100-pound bombs directly on top of the depth charges on top of the deck of the destroyer Kisarage, setting off a chain reaction that would sink the entire naval vessel. Which is literally the equivalent of killing a grown-ass man with a BB gun, but somehow he pulled it off anyways. Which, I mean, to be fair, is just...
Yeah, that's always one big weakness on naval warships, is if you hit the magazine, even if it's a relatively small shot, if you get the magazine to go up, the whole ship's going to blow up.
Standard behavior for the Marine Corps at this point. Now, the smoke settles from the battle, and they have to figure out what all happened, because, there's a lot of moving parts. Come to find out, the only thing that the Marines lost, 2 of the planes were so damaged that they weren't going to be flyable anymore, so now they're only down to 2 Grumman Wildcats, and only 5 people had been injured. Nobody died on the American side. Japan, on the other hand, had lost 2 destroyers, a submarine, and a suspected 300-plus men. Needless to say, the Japanese are fucking pissed and embarrassed about this entire thing. Which, I mean, they kind of have a right to be upset, too. I mean, this was the first 2 ships they've had sunk during World War II. This was the first tactical loss they've had, and this is the only successful amphibious landing defense using coastal artillery ever in all of World War II. They straight up kind of got their asses whooped. And because they're so upset, they pretty much immediately sent out another air raid from the Marshall Islands and bombed Wake Island again. And they continued to bomb Wake Island every day for the next 10 days.
The Japanese actually had a really strong air force. So, I mean, one of I know I was talking about kind of them blitzkrieging across the Pacific. One of the incidents that happened very shortly after Pearl Harbor, particularly relevant from a UK perspective, is 2 very big British battleships. It was the Prince of Wales and can't remember the other one. Was it something Heart, something Oak? I can't remember the other one. But anyway, they got caught by a Japanese squadron of bombers, and they were both sunk with the loss of thousands of men for the cost of virtually nothing on the Japanese side. So.
Thankfully, they still didn't manage to.
Which is kind of interesting because obviously the Pacific War was so dominated by aircraft and aircraft carriers, whereas kind of previous naval conflicts had generally been dominated by battleships.
A whole lot. Total stormtrooper energy, just misses every single time. And during this 10 days, the American people would find out that 450 Marines and a bunch of construction workers stood up to the Japanese Navy and told them to get fucked. And this became the silver lining for the catastrophe that was Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
Wake Island was a shining example that the American public...
This kind of feels like the Battle of Rorke's Drift after Isandlwana. So this is two battles in the Zulu War. The Battle of Isandlwana was one of Britain's biggest defeats in the colonial era. The entire British army got wiped out by Zulus who were not seen as being capable of fighting the British, who obviously had guns in open conflict. And then, as a result, the press put a massive amount of attention on a relatively much smaller battle at Rorke's Drift, where the British managed to hold them off. And it seems like the same vibe. It's like you lose something big, but you get one kind of heroic stand that you can then focus attention on to kind of like regain morale.
Looked to and said, if those 450 dudes were able to accomplish that when they weren't ready, imagine what we're going to be able to do once we actually start trying. This victory, unfortunately, would be short-lived because it is now a race between Japan and America to see who can get reinforcements to Wake Island first. The problem with that is the Japanese reinforcements are coming from all their other successful attack missions, including Pearl Harbor, so they have a huge head start on the Americans. So obviously they get all of their ships there first. So the Marines call up the Navy chain of command and are like, hey, there's a bunch of more Japanese ships here, including some aircraft carriers. Hurry up. At which point, the United States Navy, or maybe not the Navy, but the government, somebody at a high level decides that, well, we don't want to lose any more ships, so we're just going to consider all of Wake Island collateral damage, and we're going to leave all of you there to die.
Yeah.
I wish I was joking. So the first battle for Wake Island was on December 11th. They then got bombed every day for 10 days straight. It is now December 22nd. They have all been left there to die, except these are United States Marines, so fuck it, we're still going to fight anyways, because that's just how they get down. So December 22nd, 1941, the second battle for Wake Island is about to kick off. In the red, white, and blue corner, we have 450 Marine artillerymen, 400 construction workers, and 70 Navy corpsmen, going toe-to-toe with a reinforced Japanese Navy of 3 light cruisers, 6 destroyers, 2 PT boats, 2 amphibious landing vehicles, a bunch of more amphibious landing soldiers, 1 submarine tender, 2 submarines, 4 heavy cruisers, 2 mine layers, and 2 aircraft carriers returning from Pearl Harbor, the IJN Hiryu and the IJN Seiyu.
I mean, that's a proper entire Japanese fleet, essentially. I mean, because they got heavy cruisers, so that's big. And the aircraft carriers, so clearly the Japanese have now got their aerial supremacy over the 4 remaining American planes.
Apparently the IJN smell you and taste you were fucking busy. And now to the Marine Corps' surprise, the entire naval detachment refuses to get anywhere near this island, not willing to come within 12,000 yards because they don't want to get shot up by accurate Marine artillery fire again. So instead, what they do is they send out their 2 amphibious landing ships with 900 soldiers on them.
That sounds like a terrible idea.
They deploy every single plane that their aircraft carriers have.
Sounds like a better idea.
The 2 remaining Marine Corps Wildcat fighters are about to go toe-to-toe with 50 Japanese aircraft. And somehow, those 2 badass Marine aviators managed to shoot down 21 Japanese planes, one of which was the bomber of Bombardier Norobu Kanai, the man that was credited with sinking the USS Arizona. This would be considered the first ever revenge for Pearl Harbor. The remaining Japanese planes then proceeded to bomb and strafe the island with machine gun fire. They didn't really do a whole lot of damage, but one thing they did take out was the communication lines leaving the command bunker where Major Devereux was. And nobody knew that that had happened, so Major Devereux's inside of his bunker giving orders, but nobody's hearing them. So when the 900 Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces landed on the beach, and they weren't given any orders, the Marines are kind of like, what are we doing? What's the play? No orders came through, so they're going to do what Marines do best, be default aggressive, and go fuck shit up. Given a lack of instruction, they will resort to destruction every single time. The Marines, on their own accord, decide that they are going to fix bayonets, leave the machine guns in fortified fighting positions with the civilians that they trained, and they are going to go meet a 2-to-1 battle against the Japanese Special Landing Forces on the beach in the middle of bumfuck nowhere in the Pacific. One of these two groups is the best amphibious fighting force on Earth, and they are about to figure it out right now. For the next 11 hours, the Marine Corps and the Japanese Special Landing Forces would engage in close combat, and not only were the Marines successful at defending...
Oh, it's interesting that the Marines, by sound of things, had a defensible position, and they came out... They were so confident in their abilities, they came out of a defensive position to actually attack the Japanese landing, rather than just kind of waiting for the Japanese to come to them.
They would begin launching counterattacks, and these counterattacks would fracture the enemy line, sending small groups of enemy soldiers all over the island. It is at this point, after like 11 hours, Commander Devereaux finally comes out of his fucking bunker after not hearing from anyone this entire time, and in his head, he's thinking all of the positions that had radios must have been overrun. That's why they're not responding to me, so he's anticipating that they're losing. And as soon as he walks out of the bunker, he sees Japanese flags all over the island. And he assumes that the flags had been hoisted because the Japanese were victorious. But that's not what was happening. What he was seeing was Japanese good luck flags, which was a Japanese tradition in World War II, where the Japanese soldiers would have their friends and family sign a Japanese flag, and they would hang it on their rifle when they went into battle for good luck. That is what he was seeing, not flags hoisted in victory, because his Marines were kicking their fucking ass. But he didn't know that, so he proceeded to go around the island and force his men to surrender. Right off the bat, huge problem.
Shit.
The Japanese at this point in time
That's one hell of a misunderstanding. My God.
Big on the whole taking prisoners thing. They still very much believed in the Bushido Code of Honor, and if you surrendered on the battlefield...
Yeah, the Japanese treatment of prisoners in World War II was horrific. I mean, all prisoners, but I mean, obviously, the Chinese especially were treated absolutely just slaughtered. Westerners, they generally did take prisoner, but they kind of used them for forced labour. So you get things like the Burma Railway, where I think hundreds, maybe even thousands of Allied prisoners of war died. So yeah, it was the treatment was just awful.
Lost that honor, and as far as they're concerned, if you didn't have your honor, you deserve to die. So it's already not looking that great, and it would become even worse once the fog of the battle finally lifted, and everybody began to look around and realize there's a distinct lack of dead Americans. Plenty of dead people, not many Americans. Because over the last 11 hours, the Japanese landing forces had suffered 600 casualties. And the Americans had only lost 52 Marines and 70 construction workers. I say only, that's still a lot, it's way too many, it's tragic, I'm not trying to diminish that in any way. I'm simply trying to explain it was an extremely lopsided battle. And this would only serve to infuriate the Japanese even more. So the Japanese, now thoroughly pissed off, decide they are going to take every American on Wake Island, including the civilians that didn't even fight, and strip them all butt naked and tie them together in groups of 15 with telephone wire and march all 1,600 of them to the airfield.
So they use them as human shields, essentially, which, as I say, as we were talking about earlier, the Japanese treatment of prisoners of World War II was abysmal. I mean, as the fat electrician just said, they regarded anyone who surrendered as having kind of lost their honour, and therefore were fair game to do whatever you wanted to them, which is obviously a horrible way to think about things. Assembling their crew-served machine guns, intending on executing everyone. They then stood there for 2 days on an airstrip, butt naked in the middle of the Pacific, at gunpoint, until the Japanese admiral came out and announced to them that the Emperor of Japan had decided to grace them with their lives. You see, the American media had made such a big deal of the first defense of Wake Island that the entire world was watching the events unfold now, and Japan knew that they couldn't get away with committing such a mass atrocity without attracting too much attention, so they decided they were going to actually have to abide by the rules of war and take prisoners. The majority of the Americans would then be loaded onto cargo ships and sent to prison camps either in Japan or Japanese-occupied China. And I'm happy to say that the overwhelming majority of them survived all of World War II in these POW camps and got to return home in 1945 and 1946. Upon returning home, they would find out that only months after their first defense of Wake Island, in 1942, Hollywood had turned their life events into a movie. But the problem with the movie was that nobody actually knew what happened at the Second Battle of Wake Island, so Hollywood just anticipated that everybody had died, and that's how the movie ended. Fast forward like 45 years later, there's a Wake Island reunion event where a journalist
finally asks all the Marines what they thought of that movie when they first returned home. And without skipping a beat, this man in his 60s or 70s at this point chimes in and says, well, first of all, we didn't actually have a dog there. To which every other Marine began laughing, and it is hands down my favorite part of this story, because somehow that man lived through an entire lifetime worth of shit before he turned 25, and he's now made it into the twilight years of his life with his sense of humor intact and that innate burning desire to be a fucking smartass that every military member I've ever met has. And now, the story's gonna get weird. Whatever became of Wake Island itself, while it would remain under Japanese control for the duration of World War II, every time an American naval vessel drove past it, they would open fire on it with its guns, and they would routinely perform air raids on the island. Now, as fate would have it, one of those air raids on Wake Island would be the very first combat mission of a new pilot that joined the military at the ass end of World War II, and that pilot's name was George Bush.
Oh.
Don't worry, it's gonna get weirder. Returning now to the men as they were currently serving as prisoners of war, the vast majority were held in POW camps in Japanese-occupied China. Of all the men held there, a single Marine would escape, and he would make his way all the way to northern China, where he would find a group of Chinese communist soldiers, also not super big fans of the Japanese at this point in time, and they would decide, hey, the enemy of my enemy.
I mean, China had been having a civil war between nationalists and communists. And then it kind of got interrupted by a huge Japanese invasion. Japan attacked Manchuria in 1937. Some people consider that the actual start of the Second World War, the invasion of Manchuria. And it was an incredibly brutal conflict. I think something like 20 million Chinese were killed. And an incredibly lopsided conflict as well. Much of it was just massacres. But yeah, and as soon as that was over, as soon as the Second World War was over, the Chinese communists and the Chinese nationalists carried on fighting each other and had a very brutal civil war. So not a good time to be living in that part of the world.
Enemy is my friend. I'm going to make sure this Marine makes it home safe. And that's exactly what they did. And just as that Marine was about to set off on his final journey home, he would receive a visit from those soldiers' leader. And that leader would wish him well on his journey and gift him with several very nice Chinese rugs. That leader's name was Mao Zedong,
oh my
the
God.
Deadliest human of all time, credited with killing somewhere between 40 and 80 million people.
Yeah. So that was the guy who led the Chinese Communist Revolution and oversaw the Cultural Revolution and the Great Famine, in which, as this dude just said, killed an extremely large number of people.
The truth is literally stranger than fiction, and all of this happening, I have so many questions, but most important of all, the one question I want an answer to more than anything. What do you think that guy did with the rugs? I mean, for real, on one hand, kind of weird to keep them, but on the other hand, the rug didn't do anything, and it's a nice fucking rug! You know what I mean? Okay, this video is getting out of hand. I have to end it. In conclusion, after Pearl Harbor, the commander of the Japanese Navy, Admiral Yamamoto, would write in his personal diary, quote, I fear all we have done is awoken a sleeping giant and filled him with terrible resolve.
And
I personally find it ironic that the first time that his men would come face to face with that terrible resolve, the sleeping giant that they awoken, would be 3 days later at Wake Island, where 450 Marines, 70 Navy corpsmen, and 400 blue-collar construction workers stood together and halted the most powerful Navy on the planet in their tracks for 16 days. If you made it this far in the video, thank you for watching. The best way to support the channel is go buy some merch at thefatelectrician.com. Quack bang, out.
It's an incredible story. The bit about Mao is just insane. I always find there's so many stories like that in history where kind of people you'd never expect to meet come together. I mean, I think there's something like Hitler, Stalin, and Trotsky all lived in Vienna within about 2 miles of each other or something in like 1923. I'm getting that wrong, but it's something like that. There's just some incredible coincidences, but no, I thoroughly enjoyed that. I found it very interesting. I did know there was a Battle of Wakefield. I didn't know, but there was like 2 of them, or didn't know any of the details. It's really interesting how the Americans jumped on this for kind of propaganda purposes after Pearl Harbor. I mean, I know after Pearl Harbor there was also the Doolittle raid, where the Americans kind of surprised the Japanese by retaliating by bombing some of their targets in Japan itself, which was, again, big for obviously a relatively small operation compared to what came later, but just really big for propaganda and for kind of shocking the Japanese. The Americans could actually do that. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed. If you haven't already, please do subscribe, and I hope to see you again for a future video. Goodbye.